It was one of those suffocatingly humid summer evenings. The air felt thick, clinging to my skin. My husband was out of town, again, buried under endless work meetings and deadlines. I was alone in our sprawling suburban house, the silence pressing in like an unwanted guest. After a long day, I decided to take a bath, hoping the warm water would wash away the restlessness buzzing under my skin. I left the bathroom window cracked open to let the breeze cut through the steam. The faint sounds of distant traffic and chirping crickets filled the air. As I sank into the water, I closed my eyes, letting the tension in my shoulders dissolve. The warmth enveloped me, a temporary escape from the emptiness that had settled into my life. Just as my mind began to drift, something made me open my eyes. Instinct, maybe. I turned my head toward the window, and there he was, standing on his balcony across the way, watering his plants. The neighbor. He was new to the area, someone I'd only exchanged polite nods with. Tall, with an easy confidence about him. At first his gaze seemed accidental. Just a fleeting glance in my direction. But then he froze, his eyes locking onto mine. My breath caught. I was paralyzed by the intensity of that moment. The way his curiosity seemed to ripple through the air and touch me. Heat rose to my cheeks. I realized too late how exposed I was. My heart pounded as adrenaline surged through my veins. In a panic, I yanked the shower curtain closed, my hands trembling. The rational part of me knew it wasn't his fault. It was just bad timing, a freak coincidence. But that didn't stop my mind from spiraling. Had he seen everything? Was he still watching? And more disturbingly, why did a small, forbidden thrill spark beneath my embarrassment? I stayed behind the curtain for a moment, trying to steady my breathing. The silence was deafening. I finally forced myself to peek out. His balcony was empty now. He'd gone inside. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The image of his expression, the raw curiosity, the hesitation, was burned into my mind. As I drained the tub and wrapped myself in a towel, my thoughts refused to settle. What had just happened? It felt like I'd stepped over some invisible line, a line I hadn't even known was there until that moment. The cool air from the open window whispered against my damp skin, and for the first time in a long while I felt something. A crack in the monotony of my life, a shift I couldn't explain. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. My husband's absence felt heavier than ever. I thought about the neighbor again, his eyes, that split second of connection. I told myself it was nothing, a meaningless moment I'd forget by morning. But as I drifted into uneasy sleep, I knew I was lying to myself. The next morning felt ordinary, as if nothing had happened. But inside I was restless, my mind replaying that glance through the window like a looped film reel. I decided to shake it off with a trip to the coffee shop. A bit of normalcy. The sun was already high, heat radiating off the pavement as I walked. As I reached the corner cafe, my heart gave a strange lurch. He was there, my neighbor, standing at the counter waiting for his order. I thought about turning around, pretending I hadn't seen him, but it was too late. He glanced up, his eyes catching mine. That same flicker of recognition passed between us, just like last night. He smiled, not wide or eager, just a faint curve of the lips. "Hey," he said, his voice smooth and easy. "Good morning." I nodded, suddenly aware of my own awkwardness. "Morning," I mumbled, forcing a smile. The barista called his name and he grabbed his cup. But instead of leaving, he hesitated, stepping aside so I could order. "Their iced coffee is great on days like this," he said. I chuckled nervously. "Yeah, I guess anything cold helps." The words felt flimsy, but they seemed to bridge the gap. As I waited for my drink, we lingered near the counter, exchanging small talk. He told me he'd just moved from the city, looking for some peace and quiet. I confessed that sometimes quiet could be too quiet. He laughed, a genuine warm sound that made me feel seen. Our conversation drifted easily, like we'd known each other for years instead of minutes. Then came that moment. A natural pause, a soft silence. His eyes searched mine, the air between us crackling. My heart raced. Before I knew what I was doing, I leaned in and brushed my lips against his cheek. Just a whisper of contact. It was over in a second. My cheeks burned as I stepped back. "Sorry, But he shook his head, his smile kind. "No need to apologize." As he walked away, the warmth of that brief kiss lingered, tangled with confusion and excitement. I felt like I was walking a tightrope, unsure where it led. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about him. That fleeting touch of my lips against his cheek felt like a spark in the darkness, igniting something inside me that I couldn't control. I told myself it was a harmless moment, nothing more than a slip, a break from routine, but even I didn't believe it. It was late afternoon when I saw him again. I was in the kitchen, staring aimlessly out the window, my hands half-heartedly scrubbing dishes. There he was, standing on his balcony. His gaze drifted toward me, and instead of looking away, I held it. The tension was palpable, a silent acknowledgement of the line we'd tiptoed across. I took a shaky breath and stepped outside. The sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows across the lawn. I bent down to water my plants, my mind buzzing with unspoken thoughts. When I looked up, he was leaning on the railing, watching me. There was no hesitation in his expression, just curiosity, maybe the same curiosity I felt about him. "Nice evening," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. "It is." He paused, and I felt him choosing his words carefully. "I was wondering if you'd like to go for a walk. Just around the block." My heart thumped against my ribs. Every rational part of me screamed that this was a bad idea. But the loneliness, the dull ache of routine pushed me forward. "Okay," I said before I could change my mind. We walked side by side, the silence between us oddly comforting. He talked about how different life was here compared to the city. I confessed that sometimes my house felt more like a cage than a home. Each word chipped away at the barrier between us. We stopped at the park bench, a soft breeze ruffling the leaves. He turned to me, his eyes holding questions neither of us dared voice. Before I knew it, he reached out, his fingers lightly brushing my hand. It was such a simple gesture, but it sent a ripple through me. Then, without thinking, I leaned in. Our lips met, gentle, tentative, like testing the edge of a wave. It wasn't desperate or rushed, just a quiet acknowledgement of everything we'd been pretending not to feel. When we pulled away, reality rushed back in. A pang of guilt clenched my stomach, but the warmth of his touch lingered. We both knew we'd gone too far, but neither of us moved to undo it. I barely slept that night. The kiss haunted me, a memory that flickered between exhilaration and guilt. My mind swirled with conflicting thoughts, each one pulling me in a different direction. I wanted to believe it was just a moment of weakness, but deep down I knew it was more than that. Something had cracked open inside me, and I couldn't seem to close it. Morning arrived too quickly. My husband returned from his trip, his suitcase thudding against the hardwood floor as he walked through the door. He smiled, tired but content. "I missed you," he said, leaning in to kiss my forehead. His touch was soft, familiar, but it felt like a whisper of something long forgotten. I swallowed hard. "I missed you too," I lied. As he settled back into his routine, I tried to do the same. I folded laundry, answered emails, made dinner. But I was distracted, my thoughts slipping away to the neighbor's eyes, his smile, the warmth of his hand brushing mine. Every time I caught myself, I felt a wave of shame, but it was quickly drowned by a surge of longing. That afternoon, I caught a glimpse of him through the window. He was in his yard, fixing something by the fence. I tried to look away, but my eyes lingered. He glanced up, and for a split second our gazes met. The connection was undeniable, electric. My breath caught, and I turned away quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew this couldn't go on. We were playing with fire, and sooner or later we'd get burned. But knowing that didn't make it easier to stop. Later that evening, my husband sat at the dining table, his eyes narrowed as he scrolled through his phone. "You've been distracted lately," he said, his voice casual but tinged with suspicion. "Everything okay?" I froze, the fork halfway to my mouth. "Of course," I replied too quickly. "Just tired, I guess." He nodded slowly, but the air between us felt different, heavier. I could sense his doubt, the unspoken questions hanging there like storm clouds. The worst part was he wasn't wrong. I was slipping away from him, and he could feel it. That night, as I lay in bed next to him, I stared at the ceiling, the guilt pressing down on me like a weight. I wanted to roll over, to confess everything, to ask for forgiveness. Or maybe just understanding. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I closed my eyes and let the darkness swallow me. The days blurred together, each one heavier than the last. I went through the motions, cooking, cleaning, smiling when I had to, but I felt like I was living someone else's life. The air in the house felt thick, suffocating. My husband watched me with eyes that seemed to see everything and nothing all at once. He didn't say much, but his silence was louder than any accusation. I avoided looking at the window at the neighbor's house. But it was like trying not to breathe. My thoughts betrayed me constantly. I would catch myself wondering if he was thinking about me, if he regretted the line we'd crossed. The longing gnawed at me, sharp and relentless. One evening, I heard the sound of laughter coming from outside. My husband was on the porch talking to the neighbor. My stomach twisted into knots. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, fighting the urge to run out and stop whatever was happening. But I stayed frozen, my heart pounding in my ears. Eventually, the door creaked open. My husband's expression was unreadable, his eyes cold. "I'm going out for a bit," he said, his voice clipped. The door shut behind him with a finality that made my chest ache. I turned back to the window, unable to stop myself. The neighbor stood on his balcony looking straight at me. His eyes were filled with something I couldn't name. Regret, maybe, or resignation. For a moment, neither of us moved. The distance between us felt insurmountable. I stepped outside, my feet moving on their own. The evening air was cool, carrying the scent of cut grass and fading sunlight. He didn't speak as I approached the fence that separated our yards. We just stared at each other, the silence stretched thin between us. "I think it's over," I whispered. My voice shook, the words tasting like ash. He nodded, his face drawn. "Yeah," he said softly. "I know." There were no dramatic goodbyes, no final confessions. Just a hollow understanding that whatever we'd found in each other was too fragile to survive the real world. I turned and walked back inside, the weight of reality pressing down on me. When my husband returned, he didn't ask where I'd been. He didn't need to. The chasm between us had grown too wide. We went to bed in silence, two strangers sharing the same empty space. I lay awake, staring at the darkness, knowing things would never be the same again.